Near midnight in the 10th year of the Trojan War, an old king crossed the plain alone. Behind him, the high walls of Troy stood in darkness. Ahead, thousands of Greek soldiers slept beside the ships that had carried them across the sea. Their watchfires burned low. Spears rested against wooden shelters. Somewhere beyond the outer defenses waited the man who had killed the king's son. The king was Priam of Troy. His son was Hector, the city's greatest defender. Hector had fallen before the walls, and Achilles still refused to return his body. Grief had already taken many of Priam's children during the long war. Now it had led the old king beyond the safety of his gates, across a battlefield, and into the heart of the enemy camp. No army accompanied him. No line of Trojan guards followed his wagon. He brought only an elderly herald and treasure enough to ransom a prince, gold, fine cloth, carefully worked vessels, and gifts gathered from a royal house that had once seemed secure. In Homer's telling, the god Hermes guided Priam past the Greek guards. The camp remained strangely quiet around them. Men who might have recognized the king saw nothing. Gates opened. Shadows concealed the wagon. At last, Priam reached the enclosure of Achilles. Then the divine guide left him. Priam entered the shelter alone. Achilles had finished his evening meal. Two companions remained nearby, yet even they did not notice the old man until he was already inside. Priam crossed the room, knelt before the warrior, clasped his knees, and kissed his hands. The hands that had killed Hector. The hands that had killed other sons of Priam during the war. Achilles stared at him in silence. Outside, the camp continued to breathe in sleep. A horse shifted beside a chariot. A guard spoke quietly in the distance. The sea moved against the shore beyond the shelters. Priam could hear the ordinary sounds of the enemy world, and the calmness of those sounds made his danger feel even greater. He had entered a place where Hector's name was spoken with hatred, where the treasures of Troy were imagined as future spoils, and where almost every man had reason to resent the king before him. Yet he had come without a weapon drawn. His only protection was the hope that grief might be understood by the person who had caused it. The king of Troy had placed himself completely at his enemy's mercy. Before dawn, Achilles would decide whether his anger still had any limit, and whether 10 years of war had left enough compassion in him to return a son to his father. To understand how Priam came to kneel there, we must return to the quarrel that changed the course of the war. For almost 10 years, the Greeks had camped beside their ships on the shore below Troy. They had crossed the Aegean to recover Helen, who had left Sparta with the Trojan prince Paris. Some said she had been taken. Others said she had chosen to go. By the time the fleet reached Troy, the private wrong of one household had become a war involving kings from across the Greek world. Troy still stood behind its high walls. The Greeks had captured smaller towns, gathered cattle and treasure, and divided the spoils of war among their leaders. But they had not taken the city itself. The plain between Troy and the sea had become a place of repeated battles, funerals, and uneasy nights. Men who had arrived as young warriors had grown older beneath the same walls. The Greek army was not ruled by one king in the simple manner of a single kingdom. It was a coalition of many rulers, each proud of his own ancestry, companions, and achievements. Their supreme commander was Agamemnon, ruler of Mycenae and leader of the largest force. Their greatest fighter was Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis, commander of the Myrmidons. Agamemnon possessed authority. Achilles possessed the strength the army could least afford to lose. The difference between those two forms of power had always been dangerous. One morning, before the assembled Greeks, it became impossible to ignore. A sickness had spread through the camp. For 9 days, funeral fires burned beside the sea. Men weakened quickly. The ordinary sounds of the army were replaced by coughing, mourning, and the crackle of burning wood. The warriors did not know whether the sickness came from bad water, crowded shelters, or the anger of a god. In the world of the poem, such disasters were not separated from divine will. At last, Achilles called the warriors together. He did not command the army, but he understood that an army unable to explain its suffering could not continue. He asked whether a prophet, priest, or interpreter of dreams could tell them why Apollo had turned against them. A prophet named Calchas knew the answer. He also knew that speaking it would place him in danger. Calchas asked Achilles to swear that he would protect him. The prophet feared not Apollo, but Agamemnon. Achilles promised that no man would harm him while Achilles lived, even if the truth offended the highest commander in the camp. Only then did Calchas speak. Agamemnon had taken captive a young woman named Chryseis, the daughter of a priest of Apollo. Her father had come to the Greek ships carrying a ransom. He had begged for her return and appealed to the god he served. Most of the Greeks had wanted Agamemnon to accept the ransom. The priest was old, and the gifts were generous. Agamemnon had refused. He had sent the father away with threats. The priest then walked along the shore and prayed to Apollo for justice. In Homer's telling, the god answered by sending the sickness into the Greek camp. Chryseis must be released, Calchas said. No payment could be demanded in return. Only then would the plague end. Agamemnon rose in anger. He did not deny what he had done. He said he would return Chryseis if the army required it. But a king, in the warrior society of the poem, could not simply surrender a prize and appear to receive nothing. The captive women and treasure divided after raids were not merely possessions. They were public signs of rank, honor, and esteem. Agamemnon demanded compensation. If the Greeks would not immediately give him another prize, he warned, he would take one from another leader. Perhaps from Ajax. Perhaps from Odysseus. Perhaps from Achilles. Achilles understood the threat at once. During the war, a captive woman named Briseis had been given to him. The poem presents her as part of the spoils of war, but it also makes clear that Achilles had grown attached to her. To remove her publicly would not only deprive him of a person within his household. It would announce before the entire army that the honor awarded to Achilles could be taken away whenever Agamemnon chose. Achilles reminded the commander who had fought at the front of the army. The Trojans had never attacked Achilles' homeland. They had not stolen his cattle, burned his fields, or harmed his father. He had come to Troy for a quarrel that belonged to other men. Again and again, he had risked his life in battle, while Agamemnon received the richest share of the rewards. If courage was repaid with humiliation, Achilles said, then he would return to his ships and sail home. Agamemnon did not ask him to stay. Instead, he declared that he would take Briseis precisely so that Achilles, and every warrior watching them, would learn which man possessed the greater authority. The argument moved beyond the woman herself. It became a struggle over the order of the army. Agamemnon believed that command meant little if his decisions could be challenged by the strongest fighter. Achilles believed that command without respect was another form of theft. For one dangerous moment, Achilles reached for his sword. He imagined killing Agamemnon before the assembly. The movement was quick enough that few men understood what was about to happen. In Homer's telling, the goddess Athena appeared behind Achilles, visible only to him, and caught him by the hair. she ordered him to master the first surge of his anger. He could answer Agamemnon with words. He could speak every insult he believed the commander deserved. But he must not kill him. Achilles slowly pushed the sword back into its sheath. Then he made a promise. A day would come when the Greeks would search for him and fail to find him. Hector would drive them back toward the sea. Men would die beside the ships. And Agamemnon would understand too late what it meant to dishonor the one warrior who might have stopped him. The older warrior Nestor tried to calm them. He had advised kings before either man was born. He reminded Agamemnon that Achilles was the greatest fighter among the Greeks, and Achilles that Agamemnon commanded more men than any other king. Neither listened. When the assembly ended, Agamemnon sent 2 heralds to Achilles' shelter. The men approached reluctantly. They had not caused the quarrel, and they knew the danger of entering the space of an angry warrior. Achilles did not blame them. He called to Patroclus, his closest companion, and told him to bring Briseis outside. She followed the heralds away beside the ships. The poem gives her little voice in this moment, but her removal completes the public humiliation Achilles had feared. Achilles walked alone to the edge of the water. There, where the waves moved quietly against the shore, anger gave way to grief. He called to his mother, Thetis, the sea goddess who had known since his birth that his life would be short if he pursued glory. Achilles asked her to help him prove how necessary he was. "Let Zeus favor the Trojans for a time," he said. "Let the Greeks be driven back to their ships. Let Agamemnon see the war without Achilles and the Myrmidons. Only then would the army understand the value of the honor it had taken from him." Thetis heard her son from beneath the sea. She rose through the water, sat beside him, and listened. She could not undo the insult, but she promised to carry the request to Zeus. Achilles withdrew from the fighting. His Myrmidons remained near their shelters. His spear stayed unused. At first, his absence was a message aimed at one man. Soon it placed the entire Greek army in danger. Across the plain, the gates of Troy opened and closed beneath high stone walls. To the Greeks, Troy was the fortress they had failed to capture. To the people within it, the city was a world of courtyards, temples, workshops, storerooms, wells, and homes. Children had grown up hearing the sounds of battle beyond the walls. Families watched the gates for familiar figures and learned to read the movement of armies from the towers. The most important of those familiar figures was Hector. He was the eldest son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba, the strongest defender of Troy, and the warrior expected to stand between the Greek army and everyone inside the city. Unlike Achilles, Hector did not fight for a distant promise of fame. His father, mother, wife, child, and household were all behind him. That closeness gave his courage a different shape. Hector could imagine what defeat would mean in ordinary human terms. He knew which streets would fill with fear, which doors would be broken, and which people would be carried away. The city he defended was not an idea. It was visible whenever he turned toward the walls. During a pause in the fighting, Hector returned through the gates. He first went in search of Paris, whose decision had helped begin the war. Paris had withdrawn from the battlefield and remained inside with Helen. Hector rebuked him sharply. Other men were dying outside while the prince at the center of the conflict stayed within the safety of the city. Paris accepted the accusation. He said he would arm himself and return. Paris was not without courage. Earlier in the war he had faced Menelaus in single combat, and he would return to the field again. but he moved between bravery and withdrawal in a way that exhausted the people around him. Hector carried the consequences of decisions Paris could sometimes treat as though they belonged to someone else. That contrast made the brothers difficult to separate from the fate of Troy. Paris had helped bring the war to the city. Hector had become the man expected to hold the war outside it. Helen watched them both. She had become a figure onto whom Greeks and Trojans could place explanations for 10 years of suffering. Yet the poem often gives her a sharper awareness than the warriors themselves. She sees the weaknesses of Paris, the kindness of Hector, and the impossibility of returning to the life that existed before the ships arrived. When Hector entered the room, Helen did not ask him to praise her or excuse the war. She asked him to sit because she could see that he was tired. That small request makes his refusal more painful. Hector is surrounded by people who love him, but the role he has accepted gives him almost no permission to rest. Helen spoke to Hector with a mixture of shame and affection. In the poem, she often recognizes the suffering connected to her presence in Troy more clearly than the men around her do. She called Paris weak and wished the gods had given her a better husband. Yet she also asked Hector to rest for a moment. Hector refused. He had not returned to escape the fighting. He had come to ask the women of Troy to pray, and to see his own family before going back. He found his mother, Hecuba, and asked her to gather the older women at the temple of Athena. They were to offer the goddess the finest robe in the royal house and pray that she would protect the city from the Greek warrior Diams, who had been fighting with extraordinary force. Hecuba wanted Hector to remain long enough to drink wine and recover his strength. He declined again. Wine might weaken his limbs, he said, and he could not approach the gods with hands stained by battle. He continued through the city in search of his wife. Andromache was not at home. A servant told him that she had gone to the walls after hearing that the Trojans were being driven back. Hector hurried toward the gate and found her there with a nurse carrying their young son. Andromache came to him in tears. Her father and brothers were already dead, killed in earlier fighting. Her mother had also died. Hector was now her family, her protection, and her home. She asked him not to return to the open plain. He could command the defense from a safer place near the walls, she said. There were points where the city was more vulnerable. He could protect Troy without exposing himself to the greatest danger. Hector listened. He did not dismiss her fear. He understood it so well that he could imagine the day she dreaded. He pictured Troy falling. He pictured his father and brothers dead. Most painfully, he pictured Andromache taken away in slavery, forced to work in a foreign land while someone said that she had once been the wife of Hector. That thought caused him more sorrow than the prospect of his own death. But he could not remain behind the walls while other men fought in his place. He had learned to be brave, he said, and to stand in the front ranks of the Trojans. He fought for his father's honor and for his own, but also because the shame of withdrawing would follow him through the city. Hector was not free from pride. No hero in the poem is. Yet his pride was tied to responsibility. He believed the people of Troy had a right to expect him at the point of greatest danger. Then he reached for his son. The child recoiled and cried at the sight of the horsehair crest moving above Hector's helmet. For a moment, the fear of the battlefield entered the family scene in a smaller, almost gentle form. Hector and Andromache laughed. Hector removed the helmet and placed it on the ground. Without the bronze and the dark crest, he looked less like the defender of Troy and more like a father. He lifted the child into his arms. The boy's name was Astyanax, a title meaning Lord of the City, because the people associated his father so closely with Troy's safety. Hector prayed that his son would grow strong, become a better warrior than his father, and return from battle carrying the spoils of defeated enemies. The prayer is tender, but it also reveals how completely the values of war have entered the household. Hector can imagine a peaceful moment with his son, yet the future he asks for is another generation of strength and battle. He handed the child back to Andromache. She smiled through tears. Hector touched her and asked her not to grieve before the time appointed for him. No man, brave or cowardly, could escape death forever. She should return home, he said, and attend to the work of the household. War would be the concern of the men of Troy, and above all of Hector. The words belong to the social world of the poem, but the scene does not make their separation easy. Andromache walked away looking back repeatedly. The women in Hector's house began to mourn him even though he was still alive, because they felt that he might never return from the battlefield. Hector placed the helmet back upon his head. Paris soon caught up with him, newly armed and bright in his armor. Together, the brothers left the city and returned to the plain. Achilles fought for honor and the fame that might survive him. Hector fought with his home directly behind him. Now, with Achilles absent, Hector began to drive the Trojans forward. Without Achilles, the balance of the war began to change. The Greeks still had formidable warriors. Ajax was almost impossible to move once he planted his great shield. Diams fought with a force that frightened even the Trojans' strongest allies. Odysseus brought patience and intelligence wherever the army began to lose order. But no one replaced Achilles. Hector led repeated attacks across the plain. The Greeks were pushed back toward the defensive ditch and wall they had built around the ships. Their leaders suffered wounds. The space between Troy and the sea, once wide enough for armies to maneuver, seemed to narrow with every Trojan advance. At night, Trojan fires appeared across the plain. There were hundreds of them, perhaps more. From the Greek camp, they looked like another field of stars beneath the real sky. Around those fires, the Trojans ate, rested, and waited for morning. For the first time in years, they were not preparing merely to defend their city. They were camped close enough to threaten the ships themselves. The Greeks watched from the darkness. The ships were more than transport. They were the only road home. If Hector reached them with fire, the army would be trapped between the sea and the Trojans. Agamemnon lost confidence. He called the leaders together and spoke of launching the ships under cover of night. After 10 years of war, he was ready to abandon Troy. The others listened in disbelief. Diams rebuked him. A commander could not ask exhausted men to remain brave while announcing that he himself expected defeat. The older Nestor offered another path. The army's greatest weakness was not the wall, the ditch, or the distance from home. It was the quarrel with Achilles. Agamemnon had publicly dishonored him. If the commander wanted Achilles back, he would have to repair the damage as openly as he had caused it. Agamemnon agreed. He offered to return Briseis untouched. He promised gold, bronze, horses, and women skilled in household work. If Troy eventually fell, Achilles could choose treasure from the city. Later, he could marry one of Agamemnon's daughters and receive rich lands at home. The offer was enormous. But wealth was not the same as apology. Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix carried the message to Achilles after dark. Phoenix was an older man who had helped raise Achilles. Ajax represented the straightforward honor of the battlefield. Odysseus was chosen for his ability to speak carefully and judge the mood of another man. They walked through the camp toward the shelters of the Myrmidons. The sounds of the main army grew distant. Achilles and his men had become almost a separate community beside the same shore. The envoys found Achilles inside his shelter playing a lyre. Patroclus sat opposite him and listened. The scene was far removed from the noise of battle. Achilles, the greatest fighter in the army, was singing about the deeds of earlier heroes while refusing to create new deeds of his own. He welcomed the visitors. Whatever anger he felt toward Agamemnon, he did not treat the envoys as enemies. Food was prepared. Meat was roasted. Cups were filled. Only after the rules of hospitality had been observed did Odysseus begin to speak. He described the danger at the ships. Hector was full of confidence. The Trojans believed Zeus favored them. If Achilles did not return, Odysseus warned, he might later regret allowing men who honored him to die. Then he listed Agamemnon's gifts. The speech was skillful, but Achilles heard what was missing. Agamemnon was offering wealth because he needed Achilles' strength. He had not truly acknowledged the principle at the center of the quarrel. The commander still seemed to believe that honor could be taken in public and purchased back when convenient. Achilles refused. He said that no amount of treasure could equal a human life. Cattle could be stolen and replaced. Tripods and horses could be won again. But once a life passed beyond the barrier of the teeth, it could not be recovered. Then Achilles revealed the choice that had shaped him since youth. His mother had told him that two possible fates waited before Troy. If he remained and fought, he would never return home, but his fame would last. If he sailed back to his father's land, his glory would fade, but his life would be long. For years, Achilles had acted as though the choice had already been made. He had pursued the path of brief life and permanent fame. Now he spoke as though he might leave. The war had taught him that the brave and the cautious could receive the same reward, and that commanders could claim the work of others. Why die for men who treated his honor as temporary? Phoenix answered with a personal plea. He remembered Achilles as a child. He had fed him, carried him, and watched him grow. He asked Achilles not to let anger harden beyond repair. Even the gods could be moved by prayer and gifts. Human beings, Phoenix said, must sometimes allow themselves to be persuaded. He told an old story about another warrior who had withdrawn in anger and returned only after the best rewards had passed. The lesson was clear: Achilles should accept the offer while the army still honored him enough to make it. Achilles was moved by Phoenix, but not persuaded. Ajax then spoke more bluntly. He accused Achilles of forgetting the loyalty of his companions. A man might accept compensation even for the death of a relative, Ajax said, yet Achilles remained unmoved over the loss of one captive woman. The argument was harsh, and it did not fully understand Achilles' grievance. But it reached him more directly than Agamemnon's treasure. Achilles softened only a little. He would not return for Agamemnon. He would not fight simply because the commander had finally become afraid. But if Hector reached the ships of the Myrmidons, Achilles said, then he would decide what to do. The envoys rose to leave. They carried no promise back to the Greek leaders. Beyond the shelter, the fires of Troy continued to burn. And on the following day, Hector came closer still. The fighting moved into the Greek camp. Men struggled between wooden hulls, ropes, shelters, supply carts, and narrow paths leading to the water. Dust drifted over the shore. The ships that had carried the Greeks to Troy now formed their final line of escape. Hector reached the defenses with the confidence of a man who believed the gods had opened the road before him. The Greeks had built a ditch in front of their wall to slow chariots. For a time, the obstacle held. Horses refused the steep edge. Wheels caught in the ground. Spears crossed above the gap as both sides fought for space. Then the Trojan attack found a way through. In Homer's telling, Hector lifted a great stone and struck the gate. The wooden barrier broke. Trojans poured into the camp, and the Greeks were forced back among the ships. The battle no longer looked distant from Achilles' shelter. He could see the movement of men and the smoke rising over the defenses. He could hear the changing sound of the Greek line. Yet he still refused to join the army. Patroclus watched as well. His place beside Achilles was unlike that of an ordinary companion. Ancient traditions remembered the two men in different ways, as close friends, kinsmen, comrades raised together, and in some later interpretations as lovers. Whatever word is chosen, the emotional truth of the poem is clear. Patroclus is the person whose suffering can reach Achilles when the suffering of the wider army cannot. Patroclus had visited the wounded leaders. He had seen men return from the field supported by companions. He had listened to reports of the wall breaking and the Trojans moving among the ships. Achilles' quarrel had begun as a question of honor between two powerful men. Now ordinary warriors were paying its price. The Greeks had not all insulted Achilles. Many still respected him. Some had fought beside him for years. Patroclus could no longer watch them fall while the Myrmidons remained inactive. He approached Achilles in tears. Achilles asked why he was weeping like a child running after his mother. The comparison is not cruel so much as revealing. Achilles has withdrawn so completely into his own grievance that Patroclus' visible sorrow surprises him. Patroclus answered with anger of his own. If Achilles still refused to fight, then he should at least send the Myrmidons. Let Patroclus wear Achilles' armor. The sight of that armor at the head of fresh troops might make the Trojans believe Achilles had returned. Even a mistaken glimpse could break their confidence long enough to save the ships. The proposal offered Achilles a dangerous compromise. He could keep his promise not to fight for Agamemnon. He could protect the Myrmidons' own ships. He could allow Patroclus to help the Greeks without openly surrendering the quarrel. Achilles agreed. But his agreement came with a clear limit. "Drive the Trojans away from the ships," he said. "Once the fire was removed and the immediate danger ended, return. Do not pursue the enemy across the entire plain. Do not try to reach the walls of Troy. Do not seek a victory greater than the task requires." Achilles understood the power of momentum in battle. A retreating enemy invites pursuit. A sudden success can make even careful men believe the danger has vanished. He wanted Patroclus to borrow his appearance, not his fate. Patroclus prepared for battle. He put on Achilles' breastplate, sword, shield, and horsehair-crested helmet. He could not carry Achilles' great spear, which no other warrior could wield. But the rest of the armor was enough to transform him at a distance. The Myrmidons gathered. They had waited through days of fighting, hearing the noise beyond their shelters while remaining beside the sea. Now their leaders arranged them in companies. Spears stood close together. Shields formed a dark line. The men looked toward the smoke rising from the ships. Achilles moved among them and reminded them of their earlier anger. The Myrmidons had complained that he was keeping them from battle. Now the moment had arrived. They were to fight with discipline, save the ships, and return with honor. Before they left, Achilles poured an offering to Zeus. He used a cup reserved for prayers to the god. He washed his hands, filled the vessel with wine, and stood beneath the open sky. He asked that Patroclus drive the Trojans away and return safely with the armor and companions. Only part of the prayer would be answered. At the ships, Hector called for fire. The Trojans had reached a vessel and begun to burn its stern. Flame moved along the dry wood. Smoke rose above the camp. For the Greeks, it was the image they had feared most, the road home turning into fuel. Then the Myrmidons appeared. The armor of Achilles shone at their head. The Trojans did not have time to study the face beneath the helmet. They saw the familiar shield, the crest, and the sudden arrival of fresh troops. The belief that Achilles had returned moved through their line faster than any command. Confidence broke. The Myrmidons attacked with the force of men released after a long restraint. The Greeks rallied around them. The fire was driven from the ship. Trojans who had stood among the Greek vessels moments earlier began to retreat through the defenses. Patroclus had achieved exactly what Achilles asked. The ships were safe. He could have turned back. Instead, he continued. At first, the pursuit seemed reasonable. The Trojans were disordered. Their chariots crowded the ditch. Men dropped shields to run more quickly. Every step away from the ships made the Greek camp safer. Success carried Patroclus farther from the sea. The armor altered how others saw him, and perhaps how he saw himself. Around him, Greek warriors shouted the name of Achilles. Trojans fled from a man they believed to be the hero who had vanished from battle. Patroclus crossed the open plain. The command to return became harder to remember as the walls of Troy drew closer. He was no longer only saving the ships. He was leading an attack toward the city itself. From the towers, the people of Troy could see Achilles' armor approaching. Inside the city, families who had watched Hector drive the Greeks back now saw the shape they feared most moving toward their gates. 3 times, Patroclus tried to advance against the walls. 3 times, Apollo forced him back. The poem does not present the gods as distant symbols. They enter the action, strengthen one warrior, confuse another, and set limits that human courage cannot cross. Patroclus had reached the boundary of what he was permitted to achieve. A voice warned him that Troy was not destined to fall to him. Not even Achilles would take the city that day. Patroclus withdrew only a short distance. He still did not return to the ships. Hector saw the attack slowing and turned his chariot toward him. The battle around them became confused. Dust struck the ground beneath horses. Chariots moved through broken ranks. Bronze rang against bronze. Men fought not only for victory but for the bodies and armor of the fallen. Patroclus was still wearing the equipment of another man. The borrowed armor had saved the ships. Now it carried him toward the most dangerous point of the war. Patroclus had reached the height of his success. Behind him, the Greek ships were safe. Before him, the Trojan line was breaking. The city walls appeared close enough to touch, and every retreating enemy seemed to confirm that the danger had passed. But the nearer Patroclus came to Troy, the farther he moved from Achilles' instruction. In Homer's telling, Apollo entered the battle against him. The god approached unseen and struck Patroclus from behind. The blow confused him. The helmet of Achilles fell from his head and rolled beneath the horses. The long spear shattered in his hand. His shield slipped away. The armor that had transformed his appearance was loosened from his body. The fall of the helmet was more than the loss of protection. Until that moment, the Trojans had seen the image of Achilles. Now the disguise began to disappear. Patroclus stood exposed, exhausted, and far from the Myrmidons. A Trojan warrior named Euphorbus was the first to wound him. Euphorbus struck from behind and withdrew into the fighting. The wound did not immediately kill Patroclus, but it weakened him. He tried to move back toward the Greeks. Then Hector came forward. Hector had spent the day retreating from the figure in Achilles' armor. Now he saw the truth. The man before him was not Achilles, and he was already wounded. Hector drove his spear into Patroclus. As Patroclus fell, the two men exchanged final words. Hector declared that he had defended Troy and that the vultures would consume Patroclus far from home. Patroclus answered that Hector should not speak as though he had defeated him alone. Apollo and Euphorbus had struck first. Hector had delivered the final blow to a man already weakened. Then Patroclus warned him. Achilles would soon come for Hector. The words did not save Patroclus, but they changed the meaning of the victory. Hector had killed the man wearing Achilles' armor. He had also created the one grief powerful enough to bring Achilles back into the war. Hector removed the spear. The Greeks and Trojans closed around the body. In the warrior world of the poem, the dead did not immediately leave the battlefield. Their armor, identity, and funeral depended on the living. To recover a companion's body was an act of loyalty. To seize an enemy's body could become another form of triumph or humiliation. Hector wanted the armor. It had belonged to Achilles, passed to Patroclus, and now lay within reach of the defender of Troy. The equipment had already carried one warning. Hector took it anyway. He withdrew from the immediate fighting and put on Achilles' armor. In Homer's telling, Zeus watched him and understood the irony. Hector looked magnificent in the armor, but it did not belong to his future. He would never return it to his own house. He had placed around his body the equipment of the man destined to kill him. The battle for Patroclus continued. Menelaus reached the body first and stood over it. Euphorbus returned to claim the honor of the kill, but Menelaus struck him down. Then Hector came back, and Menelaus was forced to retreat long enough to seek Ajax. Ajax arrived with his immense shield. He stood over Patroclus like a wall. Spears struck the hide and bronze. Around him, Greeks and Trojans pushed forward and back over a small area of blood-darkened ground. The struggle lasted far longer than the death itself. At times the Trojans pulled the body toward Troy. At other moments the Greeks dragged it toward the ships. Dust covered the face of Patroclus. His armor was gone. The man who had entered battle looking like Achilles now appeared terribly vulnerable. Two horses waited nearby, the immortal horses of Achilles that had carried Patroclus' chariot. They stood motionless and refused to leave. In the poem, they lower their heads and mourn. Their manes touch the ground. A driver strikes them and speaks to them, but they do not move until Zeus gives them strength. Even the divine horses cannot understand why the human being who guided them will not rise again. At last, the Greeks formed a shield wall around the body. Ajax and the other warriors held back Hector while two companions lifted Patroclus. They carried him toward the ships as the army fought around them. It was not a victorious procession. It was a slow withdrawal beneath spears. Someone had to tell Achilles. The task fell to Antilochus, a young warrior and son of Nestor. He found Achilles near the ships, watching the battle from a distance. Achilles had already begun to fear the truth. He saw the Greeks retreating in disorder. He heard the sound of mourning. He remembered his mother's warning that the best of the Myrmidons would die while Achilles still lived. Antilochus spoke. Patroclus was dead. The Greeks had recovered the body, but Hector wore the armor. Achilles understood before the words were finished. He took dust in both hands and poured it over his head. He fell to the ground and tore at his hair. The women in the shelter cried out around him. Antilochus held Achilles' hands because he feared the warrior might cut his own throat. The cry of Achilles traveled across the shore. Thetis heard it beneath the sea. She rose with the sea nymphs and came to her son. Achilles lay beside Patroclus' body when it was brought into the camp. The man who had refused to fight for the entire army now could not imagine a life beyond the loss of one companion. Achilles spoke with a clarity his anger had not allowed before. He had asked Zeus to let the Trojans drive the Greeks back. He had wanted Agamemnon to understand his value. That wish had been granted. The Greek army had suffered. The ships had nearly burned. And Patroclus was dead. Achilles' refusal to fight had not restored what had been taken from him. It had helped create the road that carried Patroclus toward Troy. The quarrel had begun with a public insult. It ended by showing Achilles the limits of honor itself. No reward, apology, or victory could restore the person lying before him. Thetis reminded Achilles of the prophecy. If he returned to battle and killed Hector, his own death would follow soon afterward. He would never reach the old age offered by the other path. He would never see Peleus waiting in his distant home. Achilles no longer spoke of sailing away. Without Patroclus, the long life he had once considered had lost its shape. He accepted the fate he had resisted. He would return to battle. He would find Hector. And he understood that the decision would also carry him toward his own death. Achilles could not enter the fighting immediately. Hector now wore his armor. The equipment that had once announced Achilles across the battlefield had passed through the death of Patroclus and into the hands of his enemy. Thetis promised to bring new weapons. Until then, the Greeks still needed help recovering from the fighting around Patroclus' body. The Trojans pressed close, hoping to seize the corpse before it reached safety. Achilles walked to the edge of the ditch without armor. He did not cross into battle. He simply stood where the Trojans could see him. Athena placed a divine brightness around his head. Achilles shouted across the plain. The sound was joined by the goddess and carried through the Trojan ranks. Horses turned in fear. Chariots collided. Men who believed Achilles had returned in full strength began to retreat. 3 times he shouted. 3 times the Trojans were thrown into confusion. The Greeks used the moment to carry Patroclus safely into the camp. As darkness fell, Achilles remained beside the body. He placed his hands on Patroclus and promised that Hector would pay. He also promised funeral rites, but grief had already begun to pull him toward cruelty. He imagined bringing Hector's body back and sacrificing Trojan captives at the funeral fire. Thetis traveled to the house of Hephaestus, the divine smith. She found him working among furnaces and tools that moved with a life of their own. He remembered that Thetis had once protected him when he was cast from Olympus. In gratitude, he agreed to make armor for her son. The most famous piece was the shield. Hephaestus did not decorate it only with scenes of war. He placed upon it an entire human world. There were 2 cities. In one, people celebrated marriages, music filled the streets, and elders judged a dispute in a public square. In the other, an army surrounded the walls while defenders prepared an ambush. There were fields being plowed, grain being harvested, vineyards heavy with fruit, cattle moving beside a river, dancers turning in a circle, and young people singing. Above them were the earth, sea, sun, moon, and stars. Around the outer edge flowed the great river Ocean. The shield also held a quiet warning. The peaceful city and the city at war existed side by side. The harvest continued while armies gathered elsewhere. Weddings and disputes, dancing and ambushes, all belonged to the same human world. No single hero occupied the center of every scene. Achilles, who had believed the army's recognition should measure his value, was about to carry an image of life too large to be measured by one warrior's honor. The shield did not cure him. It did not remove his desire for revenge. But it surrounded that desire with reminders of everything war could interrupt and everything human beings continued to build despite it. Achilles had narrowed his world to grief and revenge. The shield presented everything else: work, law, love, celebration, danger, ordinary labor, and the movement of seasons. He would carry that whole world into battle even while seeing almost none of it. At dawn, the Achilles returned. The new armor shone so brightly that the Myrmidons could barely look at it. Achilles accepted the weapons, but first he had to end the quarrel that had removed him from the army. The Greek leaders assembled. The assembly did not become a scene of complete forgiveness. Achilles and Agamemnon did not suddenly understand one another. Their words closed the public dispute because both men now recognized that continuing it would be meaningless beside Patroclus' body. That difference matters. Reconciliation in the poem is not always the restoration of friendship. Sometimes it is the decision to stop feeding a conflict that has already taken too much. Achilles stood before them and said that he wished the dispute had never occurred. He no longer cared whether Briseis had been worth the anger. Too many men had died while he and Agamemnon fought over honor. He did not fully excuse Agamemnon. Nor did he describe himself as innocent. He simply declared that the anger must end because the army faced a greater need. Agamemnon answered with a familiar defense. He blamed delusion sent by the gods, a force that had clouded his judgment. In the world of the poem, divine influence and human responsibility often exist together. Agamemnon could say a god misled him, yet he still returned Briseis and delivered the promised gifts. The treasures were placed before the assembly. Gold, bronze, horses, and women stood as visible proof that Achilles' honor had been restored. They no longer mattered. Briseis returned and found Patroclus dead. She threw herself beside the body and mourned him. In her lament, she remembered that Patroclus had treated her with kindness and promised that Achilles would eventually make her his lawful wife. Her grief reveals another side of him. To Achilles, Patroclus had been the closest companion in the world. To Briseis, he had been one of the few people in the camp who offered hope after the destruction of her own home. Achilles refused food. Odysseus urged him to let the army eat before battle. Hunger weakened even the strongest men. Achilles wanted to fight immediately, as though speed could shorten grief. The others ate. Achilles remained beside Patroclus until Athena, unseen, sustained him with divine nourishment. Then he put on the armor. The greaves closed around his legs. The breastplate covered him. The helmet shone above his head. He lifted the shield, vast and bright with the images of human life. At last, he reached for his spear. His horses were harnessed to the chariot. Achilles spoke to them, asking them to bring him safely back from battle, unlike Patroclus. One horse answered. Xanthus, given a human voice for a moment, said that the horses would save Achilles that day. But his death was coming, not through their failure, but through the will of a god and a man. Achilles already knew. He rebuked the horse for speaking of death and climbed into the chariot. When he appeared before the Greek line, the army saw more than the return of its greatest warrior. They saw the end of the quarrel. Across the plain, the Trojans saw him too. The first Trojans to see him did not wait for proof. Rumor moved through the ranks. Achilles had returned. The new armor was brighter than the old. The Myrmidons were moving again. Men who had spent days imagining victory suddenly remembered every story told about him. Hector heard those same reports. He still wore Achilles' former armor, the visible prize of Patroclus' death. What had seemed a triumph now marked him from a distance. The equipment linked the two men before they met, Achilles approaching in weapons made by a god, Hector waiting in weapons taken from Achilles' closest companion. The direction of the war changed almost at once. Achilles moved through the battle with a force that seemed less human than elemental. Men who had stood confidently beside the Greek ships now fled toward Troy. But Achilles was not simply the warrior who had left the fighting days earlier. Grief had stripped away almost every purpose except one. He was searching for Hector. Achilles drove the Trojans back toward their city. The plain that had seemed open and victorious beneath Hector's advance now became a road of retreat. Men crossed the ground they had taken only days earlier. Chariots turned toward the gates. Warriors who had once called for fire at the Greek ships now looked over their shoulders for the figure in new armor. Achilles did not move through the battle with restraint. His grief had become fury, and the poem does not pretend that fury remains noble simply because it belongs to a hero. Achilles killed men who tried to flee. He refused offers of ransom. The river Scamander became crowded with bodies until even the river god rose against him. In Homer's telling, the water swelled around Achilles. The river accused him of filling its channels with the dead. Waves struck his shield. The current pulled at his legs and threatened to carry him away. For a moment, the greatest warrior in the Greek army was nearly defeated not by another man but by the landscape of the war itself. The gods entered the struggle. Hephaestus sent fire against the river. Trees burned along the banks. Water boiled. At last, the river yielded and Achilles continued toward Troy. The scene shows how far his revenge has carried him. He is no longer simply seeking Hector. His violence has disturbed the natural world around the battlefield. Inside Troy, Priam watched from the walls. He had seen sons return wounded and funeral processions pass through the gates. Now he saw Achilles approaching in armor that seemed to shine across the plain. The gates opened. The retreating Trojan army poured inside. Men crowded through the entrance while guards tried to keep the road clear. The city received them one by one. Hector remained outside. Priam called down to him. The old king begged his son to enter before Achilles reached the wall. He named the children already lost in the war and asked Hector not to leave his father and mother with one more body to mourn. Hecuba pleaded with him as well. Within the city were Andromache and the young son who had once feared the crest upon Hector's helmet. Hector could still pass through the gate and stand beside them. But shame held him where fear might otherwise have driven him to safety. Hector knew that he had made a terrible decision. After Patroclus had been killed, he had kept the Trojan army on the plain rather than ordering an immediate retreat. He had trusted the success near the ships and failed to imagine how completely Achilles would transform the battle. Now many Trojans had died because of that confidence. Hector imagined meeting the people inside the city. He imagined a less courageous man accusing him of destroying the army through pride. The judgment had not yet been spoken, but he already heard it. For a moment, he considered another path. He might lay down his weapons and approach Achilles without armor. He might promise to return Helen and the treasure Paris had brought from Sparta. Perhaps the wealth of Troy could still buy peace. But Hector knew the time for bargaining had passed. Achilles was not coming for treasure. Then Achilles came into view. Hector's courage failed. He ran. The movement does not erase everything courageous in Hector's life. It makes him human at the moment when the story is most tempted to turn him into a symbol. He has stood before armies, defended the gates, and returned to battle after saying farewell to his family. Now death approaches in the person of Achilles, and Hector runs from it. 3 times the 2 warriors circled the walls of Troy. Hector ran ahead. Achilles followed. Above them, the people of the city watched. They could not open the gates without risking the entry of the Greek warrior. They could not help Hector from the walls. The path carried Hector past the springs where Trojan women had once washed clothes in peaceful times before the war. The poem briefly remembers ordinary life at the very place where the city's defender is being hunted. Hector could not escape. Achilles could not yet close the distance. The gods watched. Zeus weighed the fates of the 2 men and saw Hector's side descend. Apollo, who had protected Hector, withdrew. Athena came to Achilles and promised to help him. Then she appeared beside Hector in the shape of his brother Deiphobus. Hector believed he was no longer alone. The false brother said they would face Achilles together. Strengthened by the promise, Hector stopped running and turned. Before the fight began, Hector proposed an agreement. Whoever survived would return the body of the defeated man to his people. The armor could be taken as the reward of victory, but the dead would receive burial. Achilles refused. There could be no agreement between them, he said, no more than there could be trust between lions and men or wolves and lambs. The refusal reveals the distance between the 2 warriors at that moment. Hector is prepared to fight to the death, yet still imagines a rule that survives the fighting. Achilles sees no shared rule remaining. Hector threw his spear. Athena returned it secretly to Achilles after it missed. Achilles threw his own spear, and Hector avoided it. Believing Deiphobus stood nearby, Hector turned to ask his brother for another weapon. No one was there. Only then did Hector understand. Athena had deceived him. His brother was still inside the walls. Apollo had left him. There would be no escape. Hector did not run again. He drew his sword and advanced, comparing himself to an eagle descending on its prey. In the final moment, he chose to meet death in a way the city would remember. Achilles searched the armor for an opening. It was his own former armor, the armor Patroclus had worn and Hector had taken from him. Almost every part of Hector's body was protected by equipment made for another man. There was one narrow opening near the neck. Achilles struck there. Hector fell. The wound allowed him to speak for a final moment. Hector again asked Achilles to return his body to Troy. Priam and Hecuba would offer a generous ransom. Let his parents and his city give him the funeral ode to the dead. Achilles refused again. He told Hector that no ransom would soften his anger. The answer was so extreme that even the poem allows us to feel how far Achilles has moved beyond ordinary grief. Hector spoke one last warning. Achilles' own death would come near the gates of Troy. Then Hector died. The other Greeks gathered around the body. Some were astonished by Hector's size and strength. Men who had feared him while he lived struck him after death. Achilles removed the armor. Then he pierced Hector's ankles, passed leather straps through them, and fastened the body behind his chariot. From the walls, Priam and Hecuba watched their son disappear across the plain. Andromache had not yet heard. She was inside the city preparing a bath for Hector, expecting that he might return from battle. The sound of mourning reached her. She ran toward the wall, saw the empty space where Hector should have been, and collapsed. When she recovered, she mourned not only her husband but the future of their child. Astyanax would grow without the protection of Hector. The boy once called Lord of the city had lost the man who made that title seem possible. Achilles brought the body back to the Greek camp. He had avenged Patroclus. But revenge did not quiet him. After the funeral of Patroclus, Achilles continued to drag Hector around the burial mound. Each dawn returned him to the same grief, the same anger, and the same absence. In the poem, the gods preserved Hector's body from lasting damage. They watched Achilles' sorrow, but they did not accept what his sorrow had become. At last, Zeus decided that Hector must be returned. Thetis came to Achilles with the command. "Accept a ransom," she said. "Release the body." Achilles agreed. He did not yet know who would come to claim it. Inside Troy, Priam prepared a wagon with treasure. The command of Zeus had also reached the city. The old king understood that the gods now permitted Hector's return, but permission did not remove the danger of the journey. His family begged him not to go. Hecuba feared that grief had overcome his judgment. The Greek camp was filled with men who had lost companions, brothers, and sons. Priam was not simply an old man approaching strangers. He was the king of the city they had besieged for 10 years. Any guard might kill him before he reached Achilles. Priam listened and remained determined. He would not send a servant to recover Hector. No messenger could speak with the authority of a father. No younger man could carry the same plea. Priam had ruled Troy through years of war. Now the most important act of his kingship was also the most private. He selected gifts worthy of Achilles. Fine robes were folded into the wagon. Gold was weighed. Tripods, vessels, and other treasures were gathered from the royal house. Each object had once represented wealth and continuity. Now Priam valued them only for their ability to bring his son home. Hecuba asked him to offer wine to Zeus and pray for a sign. Priam washed his hands and poured the offering. He asked the god to send an eagle on the right, a sign that the journey had divine approval. The bird appeared. Only then did the gates open. Priam climbed into the wagon with an elderly herald named Odysseus. Behind them, Troy remained dark and watchful. Ahead lay the open plain and the fires of the Greek camp. Night changed the familiar battlefield. The ground where armies had moved in daylight became a landscape of shadows. Broken wheels, abandoned weapons, burial mounds, and dried channels lay beyond the reach of the city lamps. Priam had watched the plain from the walls for years. Now he crossed it at the slow pace of horses pulling treasure. In the Iliad, Hermes met him on the road. The god appeared as a young Greek warrior. Priam was frightened. A stranger could expose them, steal the gifts, or summon the guards. Hermes spoke gently. He said that he admired Hector and had seen the body. The gods had protected it. Priam's son had not been destroyed by Achilles' treatment. The news offered the king his first comfort since Hector's death. Hermes then revealed that he had been sent to guide them. He took control of the wagon and led it toward the defenses. The Greek guards did not stop them. A heavy gate opened. The horses passed through the camp while soldiers slept nearby. The divine guide brought Priam to the enclosure of Achilles. Then Hermes left. Priam entered the shelter alone. This was the moment with which our story began. Achilles had finished his evening meal. Two companions remained nearby, yet the old king crossed the room before anyone could stop him. Priam knelt. He clasped Achilles by the knees and kissed his hands. The hands that had killed Hector. The hands that had killed other sons of Priam during the long war. Achilles stared at him in astonishment. The sight overturned every ordinary relationship between them. Priam was a king, yet he knelt as a suppliant. Achilles was his enemy, yet he alone possessed the power to answer the father's request. Priam began with the one person who could reach Achilles. "Remember your father," he said. Peleus was old and far away. He could still hope that Achilles lived. He could imagine his son returning from Troy, even if that hope grew smaller with every year. Priam no longer possessed even that hope for Hector. He had many sons when the Greeks arrived. War had taken most of them. Hector had defended the city and protected the royal house. Now he lay unburied in the camp of the man who killed him. Priam asked Achilles to respect the gods and pity him. No father, he said, should have to do what he had done. He had brought to his lips the hands of the man who killed his child. Now he asked only to take Hector home. At the mention of Peleus, Achilles' anger met something it could not overcome. He thought of the father he would never see again if the prophecy was fulfilled. He thought of Patroclus, whose death had brought him back to battle. And before him, he saw not simply the king of an enemy city but an old man carrying a grief that resembled his own. Achilles gently moved Priam away from his knees. Then the two men wept. Priam wept for Hector. Achilles wept for Patroclus and for Peleus far across the sea. For a time, neither spoke. The armies, walls, ships, and years of fighting remained outside the shelter. Inside, there were only two human beings mourning those they could not recover. Their griefs were not identical. Achilles had killed Hector. Priam was asking mercy from the person who caused his suffering. Yet the poem does not require their losses to be equal before allowing recognition to pass between them. Achilles looked at Priam with wonder. He admired the courage it had taken for the old king to cross the plain. Priam looked at Achilles and saw the strength Troy had feared for so long, but also the young man beneath it. When the weeping had passed, Achilles raised Priam to his feet. He warned the king not to provoke him further. Achilles' anger had softened, but it had not vanished. The warning reminds us that mercy here is not effortless. It is a choice made against the pressure of grief. Achilles called his companions. He ordered them to wash and prepare Hector's body away from Priam's sight. He did not want the king to see the marks of death and mistreatment and react in anger. If Priam lost control, Achilles feared his own rage might return. The body was cleaned. It was anointed with oil and wrapped in fine cloth. Achilles himself helped lift Hector onto the wagon. Then he spoke to Patroclus as though his companion could still hear him. "Do not be angry," Achilles said, "that I have returned Hector to his father. The ransom is worthy, and a proper share will be offered to you." The words show that Achilles' loyalty to Patroclus has not weakened. Mercy toward Priam does not erase grief for his companion. It changes what Achilles believes grief permits him to do. The answer withheld since the opening of our story had finally arrived. 10 years of war had not removed every trace of compassion from Achilles. Priam had what he came to seek. But Achilles would not let the old king leave immediately. The night was dangerous, and the Greeks might see the wagon before it reached the gates. Achilles invited Priam to eat. At first, the king resisted. He had not eaten since Hector's death. Food seemed impossible while his son remained unburied. Achilles told him the story of Niobe, a mother who had lost all her children and still, eventually, accepted food. Even the deepest grief, he suggested, does not release human beings from the needs of the body forever. They shared a meal beneath the same roof. The meal was not a declaration that the war had become meaningless or that the two sides were now friends. At sunrise, they would still belong to opposing armies. But eating together restored a human rhythm that violence had interrupted. Bread was passed. Meat was divided. Cups were filled. Priam, who had entered expecting death, sat beneath the roof of Achilles and was treated as a guest. For one night, hospitality became stronger than vengeance. For a little while, the father of Hector and the killer of Hector looked at one another with wonder. Priam saw the beauty and strength of the warrior Troy had feared. Achilles saw the dignity of the old king who had crossed the battlefield for his son. After they ate, Priam asked for time. The people of Troy would need days to gather wood, mourn Hector, burn the body, build the burial mound, and hold the final meal. During that time, the city would be vulnerable. Achilles asked how many days were required. Priam described the work carefully. The Trojans needed time to bring wood from the hills, a day for the funeral fire, a day for the burial mound, and only after that could the armies return to battle. Achilles promised a pause. The Greeks would not attack during Hector's funeral. This promise did more than return one body. It created a small space in which the rules of war were suspended by mutual recognition. Before sleeping, Priam and the herald were given beds outside the main shelter, where they would be less likely to be discovered. Achilles also rested. For the first time since Patroclus died, the poem allows the night around him to become quieter. Before dawn, Hermes returned. He warned Priam that remaining in the camp after sunrise was dangerous. Agamemnon did not know the Trojan king was there. If the commander discovered him, the ransom might not be enough. Priam rose. The wagon was prepared. Hector rested beneath the cloth. Hermes guided them back through the sleeping defenses and onto the plain. As the first light reached the sky, the god departed. Priam continued toward Troy. A watcher on the wall saw the wagon in the distance. The shape was familiar. The king was returning. And with him, Hector was coming home. The gates of Troy opened. News moved through the city faster than the wagon. Men and women left their homes and gathered along the road. Priam had crossed the plain as a king, but he returned as a father carrying his son. Andromache reached the wagon first. She placed her hands upon Hector and mourned the future they had lost. He had died young, leaving her within a city still surrounded by enemies. Their son was too small to understand the full meaning of the crowd, the covered body, and the cries around him. Andromache feared what would happen if Troy fell. Without Hector, there would be no one whose name alone could make the people feel protected. She imagined Astyanax growing without his father, dependent on the uncertain kindness of others. Hecuba mourned next. She remembered Hector not only as the defender of Troy but as the son dearest to her heart. Even the gods, she said, had cared enough to preserve his body. Then Helen came forward. Her lament is one of the most revealing moments at the end of the Iliad. Helen had lived in Troy for 20 years, counting the years before and during the war. Many within the city blamed her for the suffering around them. Hector had shown her kindness. He had not joined others in speaking cruelly to her. Helen mourned the one person in Priam's household who had consistently treated her with gentleness. The three women remembered different Hectors. Andromache mourned a husband and the father of her child. Hecuba mourned a son. Helen mourned a protector within an unfamiliar city. Together, their voices restored the human being beneath the title of hero. During the days Achilles had granted, the Trojans prepared the funeral. The work of mourning belonged to the whole city. Carpenters, servants, soldiers, and elders all took part. Some had known Hector personally. Others had only seen him pass through the streets in armor. Yet his absence changed the meaning of the walls for everyone. The walls still stood. The gates still opened and closed. The towers still looked across the plain. But the person most closely associated with their safety was gone. Wood was gathered from the hills. The work continued under the protection of the promised truce. Greek soldiers remained beside their ships. Trojan soldiers stayed within the city and along the roads. For a brief time, the plain was quiet. Hector was placed upon the funeral fire. The flames rose slowly. Family members, warriors, servants, and citizens stood nearby. The man who had defended Troy returned to the elements before the same walls he had protected. When the fire had burned down, the Trojans extinguished the embers with wine. They gathered Hector's remains carefully and wrapped them in cloth. The bones were placed in a golden chest and lowered into the earth. Stones were arranged above them. A burial mound rose over the place. Lookouts remained nearby. Even during the funeral, the people feared that the Greeks might break the truce. But Achilles kept his word. After the mound was completed, the Trojans returned to the house of Priam for a final meal. The Iliad ends there. It does not end with the wooden horse. It does not end with the fall of Troy. It does not even end with the death of Achilles. Those events belong to other stories in the larger tradition. Homer's poem ends with Hector buried and the battlefield briefly still. The ending is quiet not because the suffering has been solved, but because the poem chooses to stop at the moment when enemies briefly recognize the duties owed to the dead. The final image is not victory. It is a burial completed under a promise. Troy has not been saved. Achilles has not escaped his fate. Patroclus has not returned. Priam's grief has not disappeared. The war itself is not over. But for a few days, anger no longer decides what happens next. Achilles' final act in the poem is not another charge across the plain. It is the moment in which he looks at his enemy, recognizes a grieving father, and allows Hector to return to the city he defended. Priam's courage does not defeat Achilles in battle. It reaches the part of him that battle had almost destroyed. Outside the walls of Troy, the fires burn low. The Greek ships rest beside the dark water. Hector lies beneath the mound. And across the silent plain, for a little while, no one is fighting.